Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news program that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy because, well, mainly we like to think of ourselves as more of a do tank than just a think tank. Oh, certainly we think, but then we take the next step after that as well. Find out more about our work at virginiainstitute.org, and I appreciate you tuning in each and every week across the Commonwealth and online, however you may download us. Joining us for this special program, up first, a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center, Liya Palagashvili, is on with us to talk about the gig economy, and perhaps there's no greater I think he wants to cast himself as a hero, but I worry more that he'll be an ill-intentioned villain of the gig economy than our own Senator Mark Warner. Liya, thank you so much for joining us this week. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on your show. So,
I think first I want to get the parameters of what the gig economy is. I mean, we used to call it side hustles, and then when I was a kid, it was just, odd jobs, and I guess that's really where it's fallen for those of different ages. That's how you grapple with what the gig economy is. Most commonplace, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, those kind of things. But what does the gig economy encompass? Does it include things like Airbnb and Verbo and that kind of stuff as well?
Yes, so that's the best and $1,000,000 question that you ask, because sometimes when we think about the gig economy, we're only thinking about Uber and DoorDash and Lyft. But it's really important to point out that anybody engaging in independent contracting income. So if you made, a side job, like you mentioned, a side hustle, or if you have it as a primary source of your income, like let's say you're a independent contractor software developer, you're still in this group of people called, I like to call them independent workers, because it's a bit more inclusive and we're moving beyond this conception of the gig economy. And independent work is any type of work where either the worker is making their primary or supplementary source of income outside of the traditional employment-employer relationship. And I just want to point out how important this workforce is. About 1 in 10 workers, and that's approximately 11 million, engage in independent work as their primary source of income, but as many as 1 in 3 use independent work as a supplementary source of income. And one of the most incredible things about independent work and independent contracting is that it's just so diverse. So, for example, independent workers are musicians. These are, your typical freelance musician.
Sure.
Independent workers are tutors. They're writers, online marketplace sellers on Etsy. Translators, also your Uber driver or your DoorDash deliverer, your electrician or your photographer at your wedding. It really is such a diverse set of workers. And in a recent research paper, my co-author and I have found that there are over 120 different independent work roles.
Wow.
And again, I think it's just important to emphasize, because we want to move beyond this concept of the gig economy as Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, even though they're very, they're ubiquitous part of our lives. And in fact, according to official tax data, online labor platform work amounts to only a small fraction of this overall independent independent contractor workforce. And that number is small. It's 8.6%. Which means gig workers are only 8.6% of the overall independent contractor workforce. And actually what's even more interesting is, again, this is according to official IRS and Treasury Department studies, is that gig work is largely driven by workers who are supplementing their income. And again, if you look at, a company's profile, let's take Lyft, for example. I recently looked at their economic impact report. So 96% of Lyft drivers are either students or work elsewhere. And 95% of them drive fewer than 20 hours per week. So again, this is illustrating this concept that, gig work itself happens to be gig work when we think gig work as in workers on Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash and these online labor platforms. There are a small fraction of the overall independent contractor workforce, and they tend to be mostly supplemental earners.
Well, let me ask you this, because you mentioned tax, and I all of a sudden was reminded my family's tax accountant all through my childhood was an independent worker. I mean, this is not a new concept. I believe he had an accounting firm that he worked for, but he always did my parents' taxes just because they knew each other forever. I think they went to school together and that kind of thing. So why is, especially from a legislative standpoint, the House and the Senate and even locally in the General Assembly, this becomes such a cause celeb amongst elected officials to, quote, do something about or for the, quote, gig economy workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you pointed out, like independent contractors, independent workers, have been around for a while. And for many of them, like I said, for 11 million people, workers, it's their primary source of income. This is how they make a living. And the reason some of these policy proposals have sprung up in recent years is because of the emergence of the platform economy companies and concerns over misclassified gig workers. And again, these policy efforts are often justified on the grounds of, we're going after these large companies to ensure that gig workers receive proper benefits and protections. Now, the problem is these policy efforts that are aimed at gig workers specifically, they also impact the entire independent workforce more broadly. So your tax accountant, right, is impacted as well. Because independent workers, all of them, whether gig workers or your tax accountants or your nanny, they're all legally classified as independent contractors. So when you have these policy efforts, California was the big one that happened a few years ago, and the Department of Labor's role is a new thing that's popped up. When you have these policy efforts that are, aimed at going for gig workers, which again are a small minority of the independent contractor workforce, they are actually impacting the entire independent contractor workforce, all of these various different professions and people like the tax accountant that you named.
Yeah, that's, and I think, as with many legislative attempts, sometimes it's protectionist. I think in this particular instance of the New York City's City Council that wanted to shut down Uber and Lyft because the Taxi and Limousine Commission lobby was very powerful. And to be fair, it costs a lot of money to get a taxi medallion in New York City. So they were feeling like they were losing their business to these challengers, these independent contractors. So they went to city council to, quote, do something about it. But to me, that's anathema to what a free market economy is. If you're charging too much or not delivering good enough service and somebody comes along to challenge you, do what you did better is what is supposed to happen, isn't it, Liya?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And actually, that was an earlier policy battle that was fought in New York, as you mentioned. It was fought across the country and in different cities and states, but there was a big battle in New York, and that was for the ability of Uber and ride sharing to actually operate as a company. So ride sharing companies have kind of won that battle across the U.S. in different cities and states, and there's this new battle that a lot of labor groups are pushing for, and this new battle is on independent contractors in general. And so, as we saw, in California in 2019, California passed what's called Assembly Bill 5, so AB 5 for short. And what it did was create a stricter definition for being classified as an independent contractor. And their intention was, we're helping independent contractors because, now they'll be employees, right? But the problem is, and the immediate aftermath, we saw exactly this happen. Not all contracting opportunities then magically turned into employment opportunities. And so this was specifically the case for many small businesses in California. Theaters, music venues, small media organizations all had to cut their contracting jobs. This was profiled by the LA Times, and there was a bipartisan backlash against AB 5 precisely because workers in several professions neither became employees nor were able to keep their jobs as independent workers. Mm-hmm. And this is super important to tell this story right now because the Department of Labor recently published their proposed rulemaking of it's a new rule that would have a stricter definition of what it means to be an independent contractor. It's not as bad and not as narrow as California's 85, but it would have similar consequences. Maybe not as great in magnitude as California's 85 did. And one of those big consequences that I am writing about and other economists are pointing to is that we can't take for given that all of the jobs that are contracting jobs will magically turn into employment opportunities. Yeah. And so we have to accept the fact that some of these that there are going to be job losses for many independent workers across the United States. And one of the other things I wanted to point out that people often miss is because we don't think of women as independent workers, but actually women are going to be particularly impacted by this rule as they were in California. Now, the reason is because women go into independent work precisely because they value flexibility to, magnitudes more than do men, according to some of, economics research and including surveys that we've seen. Part of the reason is because women turn to independent work, again, for flexibility that they need because they are often primary child
Well, sure, it's a great opportunity. Yeah. If you have a skill but you want to raise a family, you say, well, I'm going to leave the law firm, but I'll do some pro bono work or I'll do some research if you need on the side, but I want to be able to be with my kids at least for the next bunch of years. I watched my sister do that. She was in human resources. Ironically, Viacom downsourced the entire human resources department and said, we'll hire you as a subcontractor. And I want to explore that in a moment. Liya Palagashvili is on with us. She's a senior research fellow with the Mercatus Center. And we were talking about the gig economy and restricting independent work, Liya, and you were just talking about something that led me to the regulatory capture that we so often see behind some of this stuff. The intent of some of these laws seem to be to force these companies to stop just contracting for somebody to do their bookkeeping for them and bring them on as an employee of the company. And that doesn't happen, and the politicians seem surprised. But there's a heavy cost. I've seen in some states it costs almost as much secondarily to hire somebody as it does to pay their salary. So if somebody makes $50,000 a year, they have to generate $100,000 worth of revenue to cover the costs of that one employee. Is that a fair depiction of sometimes why contract work is better for a business than the costs, regulatory costs of hiring somebody?
I don't know the exact percentage, but there has been a study that found that employees are actually about 30% more expensive. And I want to point out that this is really important for small companies, especially nonprofits and other resource-constrained organizations.
Or startups even. Startups who are trying to just kind of get their feet under them.
Startups. And contrary to our perceptions, actually, the increase in the use of contractors has been fastest for small and low-wage businesses with fewer than 20 employees. And this is according to official tax data that they examined. And, I've done my work interviewing startups and surveys, and this is one of the things I have found as well, is that tech startups in their early years, so early-stage tech startups, they heavily rely on independent contracting work in order to get their business off the ground. Now, it comes both from the fact that employees are much more expensive, but also independent contracting work offers far more flexibility, both for the worker and for the business. And many times when we actually asked the survey in our startup research, we asked, why do startups work with independent contractors? And the number one answer that we got is because they basically said, we're an early stage startup. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen to us. We need to be able to quickly move the business or scale down or scale up. And so they need individuals. They needed this flexibility, basically, given the risks associated with early stage development. Mm-hmm. And they also needed individuals just for one-off projects, or they needed specialized talent that they could not hire full-time for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And so there's a business reason why companies use startups, but we also have to understand the worker reason. If we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that 79% of independent contractors said that they prefer those work arrangements over an employment arrangement. And you might be wondering, well, why? Why is that the case? If we dig deeper and look at that survey plus many others that have come out, is that many of these workers, they either require or they value the flexibility that comes with this amount of work. And it's just so fascinating to read the surveys of independent contractors because they specifically rank job stability less than they do job flexibility. So, that might not be the case for everyone. There are some people, many people, who would much prefer to have like a stable income that provides steady income, and that's what they need. But for many other workers, they might require or they might value having more job flexibility. And that's okay. And that's part of the reason why we see many of these workers go into these type of jobs. So there's both like a worker side of it and then a business side of why some roles make sense for independent contractors and maybe others don't.
Well, let me follow you into that because the flexibility seems to go away when, as I mentioned at the onset of our visit, Liya, Virginia Senator Mark Warner is at the avant-garde of the Senate trying to create regulations mandating health care insurance and many things that are considered, part of the traditional employment model. And in every instance, it seems like that damages the opportunities for people in these gig economies because then a ride-sharing company or grocery delivery company says, well, then we can't have as many people doing this kind of work anymore. Is Mark Warner's intent misplaced in trying to force these gig economy companies, these decentralized workforces, to have things like health care benefits and pension plans and things like that?
So I think if it's mandatory, it's misplaced. And one of the things that it creates, by the way, is it allows the larger companies to be able to afford things like this, but not smaller, resource-constrained companies and nonprofits.
Sure.
But I think instead of mandating, what policymakers should aim to do is to provide access, and I'm going to highlight the word provide access, to have more desirable portable benefits options for independent contractors. And currently, there's a big policy problem. Federal and state regulations actually restrict organizations and even individuals from providing independent contractors with benefits if they want voluntarily, right? And the reason they prevent it is because these benefits have conventionally been tied to an employer-employee relationship. So if an organization were to provide benefits voluntarily to their independent contractors, those workers would likely have to be reclassified as employees and thus also lose their independence and flexibility that comes with being an independent contractor. And that's really important to emphasize. And, many companies have actually come on the record saying, we're ready and we want to give, benefits conditional on the law changing and allowing us to do so. So I think a more forward way to embrace, independent work and allowing access to portable benefits is to remove these legal barriers.
Oh, sure.
And because that's a low-hanging fruit solution, right? And it's something the IRS could easily do. So the IRS has, they have a worker classification test that they look at. So if they see the presence of benefits, for example, they might be like, oh wow, that looks like an employee, and so that's a risk to companies who might give benefits to their independent contractors. So if we want to enable access to portable benefits, the first thing that we can do, the easiest thing, is have the IRS remove that, presence of benefits factor from its worker classification test. Now, states could actually do something similar to, for workers within their state under state laws, but I think it's very important to show and to emphasize that legally companies can't give benefits to independent contractors without additional tax consequences.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, and in Virginia, I know that we've set up for healthcare benefits anyway, the ability of independent associations like the Virginia Association of Broadcasters, for example. They could start up a group, even though there's not one company, but it's an association to come up and get a group healthcare insurance going for members of that organization. So certainly that. Liya, what do you think comes next before we have to let you go? What is the future of this? I've seen certainly during COVID, this was the way many people were able to survive when they were all told their traditional jobs were, quote, non-essential by the governor. They found DoorDash and they found things that were helping people who were staying home because the governor said stay home as well. So this boomed at that point. What is the future of this? I see legislators trying to clamp down on homestay, Airbnb, VRBO, because they charge room taxes on traditional hotels, and the hotels are joining the legislators saying, yeah, go make them stop, instead of saying, hey, why are you taxing us 10 extra % on our room occupancies? So it's kind of this strange Baptist and bootleggers cabal in this. But what is in your view the future? Where does this wind up in 5-10 years?
So in terms of the future of work perspective, so from the independent contractors work, by all measures that I've seen, we're expecting this workforce to grow, not only within the gig economy, but other types of roles like the Instagram influencer, right, is an independent worker role. The fitness trainer who's self-employed is an independent worker. So by all accounts, we're expecting this type of workforce to grow. And to welcome the workers in a diversity of roles, to welcome these workers who may value or require job flexibility and who are leading the way towards more creative and entrepreneurial ways of working. I think there need to be policy reforms to pave the way for access to voluntary portable benefits. And I want to emphasize that in the surveys that we've seen, of self-employed workers, 80% of them have explicitly said, no, we don't want benefits tied to an employer. We want to have flexible, shared, or portable benefits that follow the worker around. So like an HSA account, right? And that can have contributions coming from multiple different sources. So imagine you're hiring a graphic designer for a project that you're working on. If we unleash portable benefits, access to portable benefits, you could contribute like a 1% into an HSA account for them without having additional tax consequences for you. And actually, there's other things that the IRS could do to help independent workers be on equal footing with employees. So I do think that to create a fair system for all workers, policymakers can begin to make policy reforms that will allow independent workers to receive benefits and to also allow independent workers like employees to put away pre-tax income into a fund. And
make it their doing.
Yeah, and I think independent workers need more than just, these partisan battles that are happening in a system of fair and flexible benefits, for a flexible workforce is long overdue.
Liya Palagashvili is on with us, Senior Research Fellow. Mercatus.org is where you read her stuff. Thank you so much for your visit this weekend. It is the real economic discussion of the future, although it is also of the past as well. And whether it's a side hustle or just doing odd jobs or whatever your generation called it, it's still out there. Thank you so much for your visit this week.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Coming up next, the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Jason Miyares, on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.